Well, what makes you angry? Is there any little slight, real or imagined? Or are you someone who just, is always calm? Or are you someone who flies off the handle quite easily? Is it queuing to pay at the supermarket? Is it queuing on the M6 or the M1 or the A19, whatever it is? Does that get you frustrated and angry? Is it a bad decision by the referee that robs your team of a goal? Is it other people's bad driving? Because that gets me cross. What particularly gets me cross is when people blame me for something that I don't think I'm to blame for. That gets me cross. When you think of God getting angry, and when you hear about the wrath of God, what do you think? What do you feel? For many of us, let's be honest, the thought that God gets angry isn't an idea that we like. The wrath of God is a theological idea that perhaps some of us would like to get rid of. But should we actually think like that? Because here in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus glimpses the full force of the wrath of God. And as the full reality of the cost of the cross stares him in his face, he has this agonized time of prayer. Now, Mark gives us quite a brief version. He doesn't mention sweating drops of blood, anything like that. But he does still portray to us the anguish that Jesus experienced in the garden. And he tells the story essentially in two parts. The first part focuses on Jesus and describing the experience of Jesus and his agonized prayer. And the second part focuses on the disciples and their failure to stay awake and to pray with and for Jesus. Verse 32 tells us that they went to a place called Gethsemane, which was obviously a place that they went to often with Jesus. Because, why do we know that? Because Judas knew where to go. Well, Judas, the next thing that happens is that the betrayer comes. Judas knew where to find them. He knew where Jesus was likely to be going. And then Mark tells us that he left 8 of his disciples and he took Peter and James and John a little bit further into the garden. And this is the third time in the gospel that these 3 are chosen especially to be with Jesus at specific moments. The first is in the story of Jairus' daughter, where the 3 are allowed to go into the room when Jesus raises that little girl from death. The second time is one that we looked at just a few weeks ago on the Mount of Transfiguration, and here is the third time where these 3 are specifically chosen, and we'll think about possibly why that is in a few moments. But the first thing that I really want to highlight for us this morning is that this passage gives us a glimpse into the humanity of Jesus. Up to this point, Jesus is always in control. He always knows what to do, doesn't he? He knows what to do when they're faced with a crowd of thousands and they're hungry. He knows what to do. He knows what to do when they're in a boat in a storm that's out of control, and even experienced fishermen don't know what to do. He knows what to do. He's in control. But here in the garden we get a glimpse of the vulnerability of Jesus. We get a glimpse of this as he faces up to the true magnitude of the cross and what it was going to cost him. And in verses 33 and 34, there are 4 terms that Mark uses to describe what he was experiencing, or what actually Jesus uses to describe what he was experiencing. It says he was deeply distressed. The idea that he was overwhelmed and alarmed by what was about to take place. It says he was troubled. That he was anxious. He was in anguish. He was overwhelmed with sorrow. That seems to take hold of something that Janet said, didn't she, in Let's Celebrate, about how you can be in that place where it's just a locked, dark room and there feels no way out. He was overwhelmed with sorrow. He was very sad. He was deeply grieved, however you want to think about it. And then it says, to the point of death. A sorrow so deep, it feels like it's a death. I'm not sure I can quite grasp that. I've been in some fairly low places in my life. I'm not sure I've been that low. if you've known the pain of bereavement or experienced the depths of despair that depression can bring, you'll have some little taste of what Jesus experienced in the garden. And it's really easy for us, and we do fall into this trap, to think that because Jesus was God incarnate, that somehow he kind of just sailed through all of this stuff. That somehow or other it didn't cost him anything. That it was straightforward for him to go through what he went through. And that because of that, he couldn't really possibly understand our experience. When we're going through dark times, when we ourselves are experiencing grief and loss, when we ourselves are experiencing the pit of despair, we think, how could Jesus know? But here we see that Jesus knew a depth of sorrow deeper than anything that will ever face us. Jesus faced up to something here that none of us will ever face up to. This is the depth of sorrow. It's the greatest depth of sorrow that any human being has ever known. The writer to the Hebrews says, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Have you ever spoken with someone, sharing a deeply personal experience, and as you're talking with them, you kind of realize that they're not with you, that they have really no concept of what you have been through? But I want to say that cannot be said of Jesus. You know, we can go to him and we can talk to him about what we feel. We can shout at him. You know, the Psalms are full of psalms of lament, where the psalmist just shouts out his frustration and his anger about the situation, shouts it out to God. God can take it. Jesus can take it. His experience of grief, his depth of sorrow so profound, there is no experience that we can go through that he is not able to understand, that he is not able to walk with us and empathize with us. And therefore, he is able to help us in our suffering. That is a real, real promise. And Gethsemane gives us a glimpse of the humanity and the vulnerability of Jesus. And then I want also to highlight the costliness of the cross, just to remind us. Jesus did not go serenely to his death. And you know, some of the writers point out that in most of the ancient literature, the heroes, they kind of just like went serenely to their death, you know, as if it was nothing. But there's nothing of that in how Jesus is presented. We're given the full picture of the agony of what he was facing, of what he was about to experience. It's expressed in his prayer in verses 35 and 36. Verse 35 kind of describes the content of the prayer, and then verse 36 tells us what Jesus actually said. And Jesus begins his prayer addressing God as Abba. And I know that probably all of you know that this is a word in Aramaic of close intimacy, which was used by a child addressing their father. This is a particular word, and it was a word that obviously had huge significance for the early church because they actually preserved it in its Aramaic. Everything else is in Greek, but here we have the word in its Aramaic form because it becomes so precious to them. An expression of intimacy with God, knowing God as Father. And this intimacy, this relationship that Jesus has with his Father is the reason for the profound sorrow that Jesus is experiencing, because Jesus knows in this moment that that intimacy is to be lost. So this story, this passage in Mark 14 is linked to the cry of Jesus on the cross in Mark 15, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because suddenly Jesus grasps that this relationship that meant everything to him, and we get that picture particularly in John, don't we? You know, I only do what I see the Father doing. And it's the loss of this relationship, the God-forsakenness that he was to go through at Calvary, that causes him to ask if there is any other way. Do I have to go through this? Do I have to experience this being cut off from you, completely cut off from you? And so he prayed, could you take this cup from me? And the cup in the Old Testament was a metaphor for the wrath of God. If you look in the prophets, Ezekiel and Isaiah, you'll find passages that clearly take the cup as a sign of the wrath of God. And Jesus was about to drink the cup of the wrath of God. He was about to be forsaken by his Father and experience the wrath of God for the sin of the world. The American writer and preacher Fleming Rutledge writes, "The wrath of God does not mean that God is enraged or cruel or wicked. Wrath is not an emotion of God. Wrath is the face of holiness when it's turned towards sin." Wrath is the face of holiness when it's turned towards sin. And it's really, really important that we understand this, because most of us will have known in our lives unpredictable people who fly off the handle at the drop of a hat. And some of us will have had those people in our families, and it will have formed us and shaped us in the people that we are. And I want us to understand with absolute clarity that God is not like that. The anger of God is directed towards the sin of the world, the sin that ruins and destroys us, everything that hurts us and makes us less than he wants us to be and created us to be. We don't like the idea of wrath. But the thing is this, that if you want a God of love, you have to have a God of wrath. You have to have an angry God. And think about it for a moment. If you have children, do you not get angry sometimes? And it's because you love them. You know, if your child runs out in the road, what do? You shout at them, "Stop! What are you doing? Don't be stupid!" And the child bursts into tears. But it's anger because you love them and you care for them, isn't it? And it's gone. It's gone in the moment when you know they're safe. Love and justice belong together. And if you want the world to be put right, if you want a new heaven and a new earth, then you need a God who's going to judge that which is wrong and evil. And God has judged it in the Lord Jesus Christ, and Jesus drank the cup of wrath in the garden. Tim Keller wrote that if God is loving and good, he must be angry at evil, angry enough to do something about it. And what he did was send his son to drink the cup of God's wrath by bearing our sin on the cross at Calvary. You know, in the garden, Jesus stared into the abyss of hell. He stared into the abyss of God-forsakenness and drank the cup of God's wrath by dying for us on the cross. He experienced the cosmic loneliness of separation from his Father in order that we won't have to. Because he experienced that, those of us who have faith in him, we won't have to experience that. We'll never have to know what it means to be cut off from God. He took the consequences of God's wrath on the evil of sin in order that we might be forgiven and delivered from the abyss of hell. And all of this he endured because he loves the world. He loves you and he loves me. That, in the words of the song, my sin was great, his love was greater. So facing the costliness of the cross, Jesus said, "Yet not what I will, but what you will." And then Mark turns his attention to the three disciples. Remember, this gospel is a manual for disciples. He is wanting his readers, and that includes us, to learn some lessons as they too face an uncertain future, opposition, persecution, possibly even death. That's what is possibly the experience of the people who are reading Mark's gospel for the first time. What can they learn from the failure of the disciples at this point? What is he wanting them to see and draw from the experience of the disciples? And the first thing that I think he wants them to see is that they should be encouraged by the frailty of the disciples' commitment and their slowness to grasp what Jesus was leading them into. I don't know if you've noticed as we've gone through Mark's gospel just how stupid the disciples are most of the time. How they never seem to get it. How Mark always portrays them as kind of getting the wrong end of the stick or doing the wrong thing. And you might think, why does he do that? Because these were the apostles. These were the people who planted the church, who went all over the world, poured out their lives. These guys are heroes. And yet, they're presented to us in their frailty, in their weakness, and in their failure. And you know why? Because that's us. Because that's our experience of following Jesus, isn't it? Certainly mine. You know, sometimes I just look at myself and think, what am I doing? How could I get it so wrong? I think to myself, there have been occasions recently where I've behaved so immaturely, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm 60 getting on for. When am I going to grow up? When am I going to get this sorted? Because we're frail and weak and vulnerable, and Mark wants his readers to understand that this is the normal experience for Christians, because sometimes we can get so down, as if somehow or other, sometimes we give up. I'm not good at this, I'll just give up. But we don't have to. The point is, we don't get it right, and we should be encouraged. And it's actually possible that these three were singled out to accompany Jesus on this night because of their glib self-confidence, their failure to grasp what it means to share Jesus' destiny. Think about it. James and John, they said, can we have the seats right next to you, Jesus? On your right and on your left. And Jesus said about sharing the cup, and they said, yeah, we can do that. Think about Peter. He's just said, these lot might abandon you, but I never will. And so Jesus takes them with him, and they get a glimpse of the agony that Jesus is about to go through and experience. And what do? They fall asleep. They fall asleep. Perhaps they haven't got hold of the fact that actually following Jesus isn't about sharing a privileged status. It isn't about having honor in the world. It's about sharing in the shame and the suffering. I don't know if you noticed this week that Kate Forbes became the Deputy Prime Minister, or the Deputy First Minister in Scotland, and Minister for Finance. And I don't know if you saw some of the comments that were made by her, by members of the opposition parties about her. Because of her faith, she basically believes exactly what I believe about ethical issues. But she was spoken of. There's a cost, a huge cost to following Jesus. Mark does not portray the disciples as heroes, quite the opposite. And I think that should be an encouragement to us. We are frail, we fail, we fall asleep on our watch, we deny Jesus, we want glory and mountaintop experiences, but we shirk the shame of the gospel and the cross. But I want you to see, because one of the commentators says the amazing thing about this story is that Jesus doesn't give up on them. Jesus has just been wrestling with God. He's been sweating great drops of sweat like great drops of blood. He's been agonizing. And what does he come back to do? He comforts his disciples who've fallen asleep while he's been watching them. He picks them up and speaks to them and encourages them with loving concern. So if you feel that you're failing, that you're letting him down, do not despair, because he has not given up on you. Even this morning he's coming to you and saying, I love you and I want you. Let's do this together. Wake up. A short aside here. How do you react when you feel let down in a friendship? Do we write people off? Do we move them to the periphery of our lives? I think we need to learn from Jesus. He didn't give up. We need to be patient, we need to be gracious, and we need to be forgiving in our friendships. I'm reading a book at the moment whose title has escaped me at this moment, but I'm reading this book, and it's about discipleship and maturity. And he has 4 aspects of things that he says are the basic building blocks of being a mature disciple. And the 4th one of them is that people are mellow and forgiving. And I like that. People are mellow and forgiving. We want to grow in maturity. We need to become mellow and forgiving people. Jesus was. Finally, then we should see that Mark wants us to see the contrast between the disciples' repeated sleep and Jesus' repeated prayers. As Jesus prepared for his death through vigilance and prayer, so he gives us a model for resistance to sin in our lives and to faithfulness in our service. He told the disciples to watch and pray. To watch is to stay alert, spiritually awake in the face of a severe testing of loyalties. We will go through those times where our loyalty to Jesus will be tested. And Jesus tells us we're to watch out for them. We're to watch out, we're to stay alert for them. Because actually it's much more dangerous when they creep up on us when we're distracted. And to pray reminds us of our need to align ourselves with the will of God through prayer. Sometimes extended times of prayer in which we acknowledge God's sovereign power and our willingness to accept the will of God. That's what he did, didn't he? He wrestled with God, and at the end of it, he just said, nevertheless, your will be done. I have a quote from C.H. Spurgeon on the back of one of my doors in our house. And the language is very, very flowery that Spurgeon uses, but in essence, this quote essentially says that whatever circumstance you find yourself in at this particular moment, be sure that this is the will of God for you. And then he goes on to explain why. He said, because if you knew everything that God knew, then you would have chosen this particular point for yourself. So convinced is he of the love and the goodness of God that he was able to say, this is the sovereignty of God. But however hard this point might seem, actually, I'm confident, I'm convinced that this is where God would have me. However wonderful life is, this moment, this is where God would have me. Can we have that kind of faith? Because that's actually what Jesus shows us here. It says in Hebrews again that for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. He went through everything that he went through because he knew that there was joy beyond it. We know that we have a God who loves us and a God who cares for us and a God who wants the best for us. And the example of Jesus teaches us that we're to trust him. And this is how Jesus taught us to stand. We need to be alert to the dangers of our own personal walk with God and to the dangers to our life and unity within the church. We need to be alert to these. We need to stay awake. And we need to pray for ourselves and for one another that we might trust in the sovereign purposes of God that he is working out among us. For it is Jesus who will build his church. Amen.